Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Wednesday, June 23rd, 2021. This weekend is the 15-year anniversary for us here at the 10th Amendment Center. So all this week, I'm doing some episodes focusing on some of the core principles behind our work. On Monday, I talked about natural rights as the foundation and liberty as the primary object, as Patrick Henry called it in the Virginia Ratifying Convention. And on this episode, I want to talk about the tool we use to defend those things, the tool we use to defend the Constitution, to defend natural rights, to defend liberty, that is nullification. More specifically, how it plays out in practice. A state may pass a law that sets the foundation and nullifies something, but what happens next? What kind of impact can this have in practice and effect? To be honest, it really depends, mostly on something that we get from the great treatise on economics of the 20th century, that is human action. And hopefully I can make that all come together and make sense. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. There you're going to find all the archives of the show for over 3 years. You're going to find on individual episodes like this one today, I link to the stuff that I talk about, except when I go on little side rants, but I link to stuff that I plan on talking about so you can read and learn more in context on your own time. You've got all the different platforms you can find. We've got video ones. We're on a bunch, some live streaming, some archive only. And then, of course, the audio only podcast edition on places like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, and elsewhere. That and even our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month. And we make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. Again, the show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And I just want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat while we allow people another moment or so to get notifications to join us on the live stream. Matt Lawley with a $4.99 super chat over on YouTube. Nullify everything. I really appreciate your support. Thank you so much. Liberty Revolutionary. Good to see you, buddy. Senator DT in Elkhart, Indiana, Murray Ray in Michigan, Doodly Doo, Tyler B, Clay Kent, Dixie Strong. Doodly says, just listen to the Monday episode. I appreciate the feedback on that one as well. MRGF, Bob Landry, and everyone else. I appreciate you being here. I apologize if I miss anybody, but let's get right to this. I'll try to look at the chat either in the episode a little bit later or a little bit later today. And of course, we have to start out with the great magnum opus from Ludwig von Mises. Human Action, his economic treatise, which I've got a tweet on that someone tweeted at me last night after I shared I was going to talk about this briefly at least, that I thought was just awesome. I wanted to share with you. And here is Human Action, Part 1, Chapter 1, Acting Man. And here's how Mises puts it. This is so important to us if we want to understand how to advance liberty. We talk about the Constitution and resisting and rejecting and nullifying acts that are either bad policy or unconstitutional in our view. But how do you get from point A to point B, the largest government in the history of the world, to a land of liberty? And it starts out like this. Human action, Mises writes, is purposeful behavior. Or we may say action is will put into operation and transformed into an agency, is aiming at ends and goals, is the ego's meaningful response to stimuli and to the conditions of its environment, is a person's conscious adjustment to the state of the universe that determines his life. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that sounds really interesting. It sounds good, like good philosophy. Of course, human beings make decisions on what they want to do. They respond to stimuli and so on and so forth. But what the hell are you talking about in economics treatise? And I think the good way to sum this up first, because I know people will ask me that, and I tweeted about it last night. Like, what are you doing talking about this in regards to nullification? What does it have to do with anything? And I know some of you already get this. But this is a great reply to my tweet. You can follow me over at twitter.com/Michael Bolden. Here's Adam, no fun in 10 dead. He says the first 20% of human action isn't even economics. It is an economics treatise in the classical sense. The examination of praxeology and the insights on choice and political philosophy are mind-blowing. The first 194 pages a required reading for purely philosophical reasons. Then he goes into ABCT on 209. So we're talking about human action, but what does this have to do with nullification? It may be interesting for those of you who come to us from a free market perspective, from an economics perspective, from a libertarian perspective, but what does this have to do with nullification? I think to get there, to get to that understanding, we have to first think about how we define nullification. There's actually a bunch of ways we define it. I know I've covered this in some detail. There's a bunch of ways that has actually been defined in practice over the years, but there's really two primary categories. For example, one is the legal category. So if this action happens, if A happens, then B, the law in question is gone. It's not enforced, it's not on the books, it's overturned, no one follows it, no one enforces it, etc. It's done. So for example, I mean, maybe not a legal example, I go to a diner, I order a coffee. I got the idea to talk about this from Tom Woods some years ago. And he says, we should start using the word nullify in day-to-day conversations. Like, oh, go to a diner. You know, I'm with my breakfast, I want a cup of coffee with that. No, I want to nullify that. I mean, no one's still trying to bring you the coffee. The order for the coffee's been nullified. Now, the other example is the practical definition. One side claims the power to do something. The other side says, too bad. We're going to go with our approach anyways. They say you can't do something. We're going to do it anyway. So when you think about speed limits, every time you're going a few miles an hour over the speed limit, you are personally nullifying that speed law in practice. And in fact, a lot of times it turns out to be a numbers game. And when it comes to state or local nullification of a federal act, almost no one in history has ever even tried, much less used the legal approach, where a state says this is unconstitutional and then expects everyone else to follow. Now, it has happened a few times or has been tried a few times, but no one has really recognized this in the legal system. So most of the times when we're talking about nullification, whether it's the Fugitive Slave Act or it's against a prohibition on whatever product, a plant or a tool of self-defense, these are always actions where we're talking about nullification in practice and effect. Now, I talked about these definitions and how this all plays out quite a bit more in an episode back in April called Anti-Nullification Propaganda Definitions Matter. And a lot of people want to focus on the one definition that if a state says something is unconstitutional, this is then all of a sudden the federal government has to actually just see it as that and then stop enforcing it. I mean, just think of it this way. Let's say your state passed some law, or even your local community passed some ordinance to declare all federal prohibition on plants, on tools, on anything else to be unconstitutional, illegal, immoral, null, and void. Let's say that happened. That would be awesome, right? I mean, in theory. But do you think for a moment, and I don't think any of us do, I don't, do you think for a moment that the federal government's going to be like, well, such and such county said restrictions on the right to keep and bear arms are now unconstitutional, so we can't do it. Or such and state of Texas says we aren't allowed to do this, so we're just going to stop. Do you think for a moment that some ATF agent or a DEA agent says, well, California says that we can't enforce cannabis prohibition anymore, so, well, I better go get a new job. And you're not going to see an ATF agent do the same type of thing in Texas or Missouri or Arizona on the right to keep and bear arms. Now, they're going to probably, in practice, they'll probably fire off some threatening letters if a state tries to take this position. They'll fire off some letters. They'll probably even think about doing a lawsuit. They may threaten. And at some point, if there's a conflict on this, we know how these types of things play out. But what we don't know exactly how it's going to happen in practice, what the feds are going to do. This is a market response in some ways. Like the feds are going to do something in response to how the people play out. And that's what I'm going to get to in a moment. But what we know will not happen is just because a state or a local community says something is unconstitutional, we never just see the feds just merely back off. Oh, okay, we're not allowed to do this anymore. This is an absurd comic book version of nullification that really has almost never been tried and has never been successful in history. And here's how I actually discussed this. I was asked by a syndicated columnist to talk about the practical impact, what I think the practical impact of the recently enacted Missouri Second Amendment Preservation Act, a piece of legislation that we consider one of the strongest, if not the strongest, state-level acts ever passed to protect the right to keep and bear arms from federal infringement, which there's a ton of. And he asked, well, how is this going to play out in practice? Will it really do something? And I wrote this. As far as the immediate practical impact, it's really more about human action. That is, what the market actually decides to do. I go on. When states, for example, and I'm not going to be able to link to this one because I just basically printed it out to PDF so I could share with you here. When states, for example, started legalizing marijuana for medical or recreational purposes, if the people decided to still follow federal law banning it, rather than seeing state law as the political and legal cover to use the plant anyways, there would have been no practical impact on federal prohibition whatsoever. And I can't hammer that home enough. No matter what law your state passes that you think is nullifying a federal act, even if it literally says none of these will ever be enforced by anyone at any level, state, local, or federal, this restriction on your right to keep and bear arms or on your right to own and grow a plant or whatever in between. No matter what happens, no matter what your state or local community passes, if everyone continues to follow the federal prohibition, the federal act anyway, nothing has ever been nullified. It was an idea that didn't play out in practice. It really requires further action by the people. We covered this in our 2019 to 20 State of the Nullification Movement report, which we had updated around this time last year. We're going to have a newly released annual report for this sometime in the fall. And here's how we put it talking about this process. When we've seen people rely on government efforts alone, that is, relying solely on a state to take a stand against the federal government, keep in mind, it should be very obvious to all of us now that all state governments are evil. They're just not the biggest government in the history of the world. That is, the government that is supposed to be the general or federal government in Washington, D.C., and they do a lot of stuff on behalf of the federal government. So the idea that a state government just on its own is going to stand up to the hand that feeds it is pretty absurd. But we've seen that it can be pushed in certain directions on areas that are popular amongst the people in each state, and the federal system allows us this leeway to be able to take action. But when people rely solely on the state or, let's say, a local community, this all applies to both, solely on just them passing some law in the hopes that all of a sudden the federal act is going to be gone, it hasn't played out too well. And that's how we put it. It has not fared well over the long haul. For example, after passage of the Real ID Act in 2005, multiple states passed laws blocking the implementation of what we see as an unconstitutional national ID program. But over the last few years, so over the years, a majority of states still hadn't complied. But in the last few years, specifically 3-4 years that we've seen, a number of states have started to flip things around. The resistance, we wrote, has withered under constant federal pressure. A number of states that initially passed laws prohibiting implementation of Real ID, including Idaho, Oklahoma, and Utah, have reversed course. For example, the exact same governor in Utah signed 2 pieces of legislation over a period, I'm not sure, maybe it was 6 years or 8 years or 10 years. But the first one he signed said, the Real ID Act is inimical to the liberty of the people of this state, and we will not participate. He specifically had inimical to the liberty of the people or to the Constitution. And then a few years later, decides to flip course and sign something totally opposite and says, well, we have to have this and we're going to sign it. Now, of course, some people can change their mind, but this, I think, just shows that when you just solely rely on a government to do something, you're not going to get the results that you want. And that's how we put it in the report. The lesson here is clear. Government action alone is an unreliable way to resist federal power. It is essential that individuals commit themselves to exercise their freedom. We're talking about individuals exercising, taking human action whether Washington, D.C. wants them to or not. And I have cited Thomas Jefferson on this so many times. He's not calling it human action. I don't think the study of praxeology came around until somewhere in the 19th century. So I don't think maybe he had some philosophical understandings of what the foundational principles were behind it. But here's how he put it in 1774. A free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as the gift of their chief magistrate. And this is the type of thing that we put when we covered. So Mike Meharry reported on the passage of the Missouri Second Amendment Preservation Act. And this gets back to that question that I got from the columnist. How is this going to play out in practice? Well, we always try to include when we cover nullification or nullification-esque, nullification foundational legislation, we always try to include a what's next. Whether it's like still going through the process and we're encouraging people to take action and support, or, well, now that something's passed, what do we have to do? And here's how Meharry put it at the end of that report, which I will link to in the show notes. With SAPA, Second Amendment Preservation Act, now in effect, how it plays out in practice will only be determined by human action. Those who are willing to exercise their rights, those who are willing to keep the pressure on law enforcement to ensure they're held accountable, and those who are willing to start taking the next steps to remove more gun control from Missouri state law in the coming years. Now, those are only 3 more steps, but it really gets down to people have to be willing to exercise their rights, whether the government wants them to or not. And that's how John Dickinson, the great penman of the Revolution, put it in his it should be a famous broadside. It probably was in the region in Pennsylvania in 1765 in response to the Stamp Act. And here's how he put it. If you comply with the act. So when we look at the nullification of the Stamp Act, which I'll get to in a moment, we know that there were state-level resolutions, there was like a local court opinion saying no one had to enforce it, there was opposition from the governmental level at various areas. Stamp affixers wouldn't do the job, a sheriff wouldn't go arrest people, for example. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about is compliance or not. And Dickinson, penman of the Revolution before he got that nickname, he reminded us this is an important, timeless message. If you comply with the act, you rivet perpetual chains upon your unhappy country. And he went further and he says, the Stamp Act, therefore, is to be regarded only as an experiment of your disposition. And I like how he put experiment of your disposition in all caps. Generally, when people are sending me email forwards or something and it's got all caps, they're yelling at me. But he's really highlighting this. And I think this is a message of human action as well. They may pass something, but what's the disposition of the people in response? As long as they continue to comply with it, of course, they're riveting those perpetual chains around their country and around their own liberty. But if no one complies, then what happens? He says, if you quietly bend your necks to that yoke, you prove yourselves ready to receive any bondage to which your lords and masters shall please to subject you. And he says, for these reasons and many more, you can read the whole thing. It's a pretty cool response calling for mass civil disobedience, mass rejection of the Stamp Act because they were recognizing there's an enforcement action that has to happen. And as long as people don't comply, then you have a different story. He says, it appears to me to be the wisest and safest course for you to proceed in all business as usual. Just pretend they never even passed the thing without taking the least notice of the Stamp Act. He says, if you behave in this spirited manner, you may be assured that every colony on the continent will follow the example of a province so justly celebrated for its liberty. Your conduct will convince Great Britain that the Stamp Act will never be carried into execution but by force of arms, and this one moment's reflection must demonstrate that she will never attempt. This was published in Philadelphia in November of 1765. It's very similar to a message that I've cited a number of times from the great John Hancock here in a letter to his London agent, Jonathan Bernard, just weeks before the Stamp Act was going to go into effect, around the same time that Dickinson published that. He put it this way: the people of this country will never be made slaves of by a submission to the Stamp Act. No, even better. The people of this country, I should know this, the people of this country will never be made slaves of by a submission to the damned act. Now, I covered, and I just mentioned this a moment or so ago, I covered this people's nullification of the Stamp Act. I got a lot of the information on this from Conceived in Liberty, the now 5 multi-volume must-read set from the late, great Murray Rothbard on the beginnings. Well, you can read it. It's great history on the founding and settlement of the country. The people's nullification of the Stamp Act, here's the overview. A combination of protests, declarations, disobedience, local resolutions, support from merchants, and non-enforcement by sheriffs and other local officials created a climate where the Stamp Act was unenforceable. I think the message is merely passing a resolution, merely passing a local law or a state law or resolution or something like that on its own isn't going to get the job done. Maybe we'll get lucky, but the odds are highly against it. It really takes, you can't have nullification without a willingness of the people to defy the act that the nullification attempt is going after. You don't have nullification without human action, without mass resistance, without support from the people. And I encourage you to check out that episode. We've got a lot of great strategic advice. It's a great strategy lesson for how to deal with federal power today. And I think at the end of the day, really, when we're talking about nullification, if people do nothing, there's never any nullification ever, no matter what a state happens to pass. But when enough people say no to a federal act, to a federal prohibition, for example, and enough states or local communities pass laws backing those people up, there's not much the feds can do to force their so-called laws, regulations, or mandates down our throats, and we get nullification in practice and effect. And one more quick passage here that I want to read to you before we head out. This is from a great article published by Derek Sheriff, who used to write for us a lot. He just recently left a review over on Apple Podcasts, which I'm very appreciative. I didn't realize he was still following our work. I haven't talked to him in a number of years, but he wrote a lot of great articles back in the day. This is from 2010 or 2012, something like that. I will link to it in the show notes. And he's talking about nullification in one lesson. He says, in order to understand what nullification is, you have to first understand what it is not. And he put it this way. Nullification is not secession or insurrection, but neither is it unconditional or unlimited submission. Nullification is not something that requires any decision, statement, or action from any branch of the federal government. Nullification is not the result of obtaining a favorable court ruling. Nullification is not the petitioning of the federal government to start doing or to stop doing anything. It's not asking for permission from the federal government. Please stop doing this. That's not nullifying. That's the largest government in the history of the world just deciding that it doesn't have the resources or deciding that it doesn't have the political willpower to go through with something that it wants to do. Nullification, he writes, does not depend on any federal law being repealed. The repeal may be the result of the nullification, though. And he says nullification does not require permission from any person or institution outside of one's own state. And he defines it like this. Nullification is any act or set of acts which has as its end result a particular law being rendered null and void or just plain unenforceable in your area. So nullification only happens in practice and effect with human action on a large scale. When the market understands that they want more liberty, the people decide they want more liberty despite federal laws, government laws saying the opposite, that's when you can have real nullification. It certainly makes it much easier when you can get these two branches or two levels of government, the evil state government, deciding to look good for the people who live there, to take a stand against the federal government or to at least back off on enforcement. Most federal government programs are enforced with the participation of state or local governments, most of them. And the dirty little secret that the supporters of the monster state don't want you to know is that partnerships don't work too well when half the team quits. I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I hope you enjoyed the content. I hope you learned something. I hope it made you think. I will link, of course, to the entire text of Human Action, which I encourage you to read, at least that first 196 pages if you want to read the philosophy rather than the economics part. The first, 196 pages are pure philosophy, political action that can be based off of this understanding is very, very important. It's available for free at the Mises Institute, Mises.org. I will link to the articles and episodes that I talked about as well. Of course, if you support the show, you like this episode, there's a few free, easy peasy things that you can do to help us spread the word. Most of the mainstream platforms that you watch or listen on are pretty easily triggered in their algorithm. So smashing a like button, leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, leaving comments, especially in the archive, sharing links, subscribing, getting notifications, all that stuff triggers the algorithm of the platform, and it tells the algorithm to show the program to more people. I can't thank you enough for the help. And of course, if you want to put your financial faith behind our work, help us celebrate this 15 years. Recognize that we're just scratching the surface, but we're reaching and teaching more and more people every day, and help us set the foundation for the next 15 years. I'd be extremely grateful for any consideration you can give to joining us today. It starts out as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I will check through the live chat a little bit later today and reply to as many comments as I'm able to. Please continue leaving those comments in the archive as well. I get tons of great ideas for future episodes as well. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you on Friday here at the Path to Liberty.